They said the file was cursed. Archivists whispered that even touching it brought nightmares. A sealed document marked March 1847, locked inside the South Carolina Historical Society vault. On its cover, 5 words etched in fading ink: "May God forgive what men have done." Inside were 8 testimonies, 8 men, all slave owners, all mutilated in the exact same way. Castrated, not by rage, but with surgical precision, and every attack happened within 24 hours of an act they swore no one knew about. The men begged for secrecy. The church refused to bury the truth. The state sealed the records. And the name that haunted those pages was one whispered only in the slave quarters: Silas the Silent. A field hand who could not speak. A man broken in body, but not in will. He was supposed to die voiceless and forgotten. Instead, he became the echo that mutilated the men who owned him. A shadow that moved like justice without mercy. Tonight, you'll hear the story they tried to erase. But understand this: once you hear his name, you'll feel it watching you, because Silas never stopped listening. Silas was born into a world that fed on screams. South Carolina, 1815, a place where the sun burned like judgment and the rice fields were graves that never closed. His mother, Patience, was a woman who spoke to no one after dark. Her child, they said, was born under a blood moon. The overseers laughed. The elders did not. Plantation ledgers recorded one word beside his name: mulatto. That meant his father was white, most likely the same man who ordered his mother whipped when she refused him one night. Silas was the living proof of that defiance, and on the plantation, proof was a death sentence. He grew fast, too quiet for his age. By 7, he was in the fields. By 10, he'd already learned the rhythm of human cruelty: when to disappear, when to look away. There, the overseers said his silence was unnatural, but the others whispered that he listened to things the rest of them couldn't, that he remembered what the land itself was trying to forget. When he looked at the masters, they said it felt like standing in front of a mirror that showed your soul and all the rot inside it. But the world would break that voice before it ever learned what he was capable of. He was 13 when they took his voice. The plantation records called it a discipline incident. That phrase covered everything from branding to murder, but witnesses later said it began after an overseer accused Silas of watching too closely. The man dragged him to the smokehouse, where screams were muffled by thick oak walls, and left him there until sunset. When Silas emerged, his throat was torn open. The doctor wrote coldly: "Severe laryngeal injury, cause undetermined, prognosis, permanent loss of speech." Permanent. He tried to speak once, a week later. What came out wasn't a voice. It was a rasp, a sound that made even the children cry. After that, he stopped trying. His eyes became his language, his silence, his weapon. Something changed in him after that night. He moved like he'd seen the blueprint of cruelty, and decided he would rewrite it. He studied the patterns of men, their sins, their rituals of power. He knew which doors stayed unlocked, which masters drank alone, which ones visited the quarters when the moon was high. They thought they had broken him, but they had only stripped him of the one thing that kept his fury human. The silence became sacred, and in that silence, vengeance began to breathe. August 1836. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of rice rot and swamp water. On the Grayson plantation, a man of wealth and cruelty slept beside his wife, dreaming of profits. But just hours before, he'd visited the shed where a borrowed field hand from the neighboring Rutledge estate was kept for the night. A young man who could not speak, whose pale eyes reflected nothing. Nathaniel Grayson thought himself untouchable. In that world, men like him were gods, but gods forget that even slaves have shadows. When dawn came, his wife found him in bed, alive, but soaked in his own blood. His voice trembled as he whispered what little he could remember. A hand over his mouth, a blade that cut clean as lightning, and the sound of breathing. Not rushed, not panicked. Calm, deliberate. The door had been locked from the inside. No footprints, no struggle, no witnesses. The sheriff's men whipped the enslaved, tortured them for confessions that never came, and in the quarters, people said nothing. Only one name drifted between them like smoke. Silas. The man who could not speak had found a language sharper than words, and the first man who used him had paid the price in flesh. 18 months later, it happened again. Different man, same silence. Thomas Wainwright, planter, church deacon, and man of honor. He preached obedience on Sundays and prowled the slave quarters on Mondays. That winter he hired a carpenter from the Rutledge estate, a quiet mulatto with a scar at his throat. Silas. For 3 days, Silas worked repairing the sheds, never spoke, never met anyone's eyes. On the second night, Wainwright visited his shed under the cover of darkness. He left adjusting his belt. The next evening, Silas was gone, returned to the Rutledge plantation. 2 days later, Wainwright's overseer found him sprawled across his account books, bleeding, half-conscious, mutilated in the exact same way as Nathaniel Grayson. Same precision, same absence of struggle, same impossibility. The white press called it the devil's work. The patrols hunted for abolitionists. But the enslaved didn't need a name for what they already understood. They called it balance. Some said Silas moved through shadows like mist. Others swore he walked straight through locked doors. None dared say his name too loudly, as if to summon him was to draw his gaze. But those who had used him felt that gaze already. The Silent One had begun his sermon, and his gospel was fear. By 1840, 4 masters had fallen, each mutilated with surgical precision, each attack unfolding in rooms locked from the inside. The plantation elite whispered of demons, voodoo, curses, but beneath their terror lay a quieter fear that one of their own creations had turned predator. They doubled the patrols, armed the overseers, chained the doors of slave quarters at night, but still the attacks came, always unseen, always silent. Silas was never suspected. He was a ghost of the system, a rented hand passed between plantations for his skill with wood and tools. He slept in sheds, in attics, in corners no one bothered to notice. To the masters, he was barely human. To the enslaved, he was the whisper of judgment made flesh. What no one realized was that every attack followed a pattern. 24 hours after an unspeakable act, the abuse of a boy, the violation of a woman, the kind of horror that left no mark in the ledgers, only in the eyes of the broken. When the nights grew still, some said they could feel him watching, not from the shadows, but from inside the silence itself. The masters had built an empire on bodies. Now, one of those bodies had learned how to strike back without making a sound. Sheriff Benjamin Carr called it an infection of madness. The planters called it divine punishment. But the truth was simpler. Someone was studying them. By 1841, Carr noticed the pattern. Each mutilation happened within a 20-mile radius of the Rutledge estate. Each victim had, days before, borrowed a laborer from that same plantation, the same man, the same silence, Silas. But Carr's notes never reached Charleston. Plantation owners blocked every attempt to dig deeper. To name the crimes would mean naming the abuses that caused them. It would mean admitting that these civilized men violated those they owned. So the silence grew, and Silas thrived in it. He began moving with frightening purpose. No random vengeance now, no emotion. Each strike was precise, like a surgeon removing rot from a body. Some said he carried a blade carved from plantation iron, cooled in river water, blessed by the mothers of the abused. Those who met his eyes described something terrifying, Not rage, but clarity. The look of a man who no longer believed in survival, only in balance. And every time another master screamed, the others locked their doors tighter, not realizing the danger was already inside. By 1843, Silas was no longer a man. He was a whisper that walked. In the quarters, they spoke of him with trembling reverence. The Silent One. A ghost, a curse, a reckoning. Some prayed to him in secret. Others refused to speak his name, fearing that summoning him meant judgment. Because Silas didn't just punish masters, he punished any man who mirrored them. A rumor spread. A black overseer caught abusing a young girl vanished one night. The next morning, he was found behind the sugar barn, mutilated like the masters. No witnesses, no sound. That changed everything. The enslaved began to fear the same silence that had once protected them. But fear can purify too. Or every act of cruelty that vanished in the dark. Whispers said Silas had balanced it. He had become the conscience of a world that had none. And yet, some began to wonder what drove him. Was it revenge, or was he cleansing something deeper? The rot that men carried in their blood. One elder woman told her grandchildren, "He don't kill from hate. He kills from knowing." That knowing, that unbearable awareness, was what made Silas more than mortal. It made him eternal. By 1844, paranoia had become a plague. Planters no longer trusted their overseers. Overseers no longer trusted their slaves. Husbands eyed wives with suspicion, certain that Silas would come for them next. Sleep vanished from the Low Country. Doors were barred with iron. Guns stayed loaded on nightstands. And yet, every few months, another scream, another man found opened and emptied, his body untouched except where it mattered most. The white elite began to blame one another. Some claimed rival families were hiring the mute slave as an assassin. Others swore the abolitionists had trained him to spark rebellion. But what truly terrified them was the possibility that Silas wasn't just killing, he was teaching. Men began confessing sins before their deaths, begging God for forgiveness, terrified their secrets had already reached the ears of the Silent One. Ministers preached of Satan's hand. Physicians claimed slave hysteria, but every explanation only deepened the dread. Because no one could explain how he entered locked homes, how dogs never barked, how not a single soul had ever seen him strike. One plantation wife wrote in her diary, "He moves like our guilt, unseen but always present. And guilt, once awakened, can't be killed. It only multiplies." The summer of 1845 marked the beginning of the hunt. 20 armed riders, slave catchers, deputies, bounty hunters, rode through the marshes with dogs, torches, and fear thick in their throats. Their orders were simple: bring back the mute carpenter, dead or alive. The Rutledge family, who once profited from renting Silas, now put a price on his head higher than the governor's. But deep down, they knew it wasn't just a man they were chasing. It was what he represented. The mirror of their sins made flesh. For weeks they scoured the rice fields, turning up nothing but footprints that led into swamps and vanished. One by one, their dogs refused to track, whimpering, backing away from the reeds, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. Then came the killings, not of masters this time, but of the hunters themselves, each found in the same way, throat slit, trousers torn open, emasculated. But now something new, carved into their flesh, a single S. The message was clear: stop hunting what you created. By August, only 4 men remained of the 20 who'd gone searching. They turned back, broken, swearing they'd seen him standing in the marsh, half man, half shadow, and that when he looked at them, the world fell silent. When the survivors returned, they were no longer men, just vessels of terror. They stumbled into Charleston pale and shaking, clothes soaked with swamp water and blood, eyes vacant as if they'd stared into something beyond comprehension. They refused to speak Silas's name, calling him it. They said the swamp had gone silent. No frogs, no birds, just breathing. Steady, human, close. One swore he saw Silas standing waist-deep in black water, holding a rusted blade, his throat scar glowing faintly like iron from a forge. Another claimed he never saw him at all, only felt a hand press over his mouth in the dark. Word spread faster than fire. Plantations emptied, some fled north. Others turned on their own slaves, accusing them of harboring the spirit. The patrols grew violent, the lashings doubled, and yet every act of cruelty only invited another death. The Rutledge patriarch himself fell next, found in his study, his face calm, eyes open, the mark of an S burned into the wood of his desk. No one saw Silas again, but they all began hearing him, not with their ears, but in their conscience. The silence he left behind was louder than any scream. By 1846, the name Silas the Silent had traveled farther than any runaway ever could. Across the Mason-Dixon line, abolitionist newspapers printed fragments of his story, the mute slave who hunted sin itself. They called him a phantom of justice, a spirit of divine revenge. But in the quarters, the stories were older, darker, truer. They said he wasn't born mute. His voice had been taken when he witnessed his mother's murder, cut out by a master who feared his screams. That scar on his throat wasn't silence, it was memory. To those who still lived in chains, Silas became more than a myth. He was a promise. Mothers whispered his story to their sons at night, saying, "One day, silence will speak again." Songs began to spread, quiet field chants about the man who walked without sound and spoke through blood. Even up north, freedmen told his story in secret circles, not as vengeance, but as warning, that evil left unchecked breeds its own avenger. And though no one had seen him in years, plantation owners still flinched when doors creaked or windows opened on their own. Because the wind carried his legend, a soundless reminder that justice had learned to walk barefoot. Decades passed, the Civil War ended, slavery was abolished, the world moved on, but not Silas. Freedmen told stories in whispered corners, a pale, silent figure moving through abandoned plantations, carrying nothing but a carpenter's tools and a shadow that stretched like smoke. He was said to appear where injustice lingered, in homes built on cruelty, in towns that had forgotten the screams of the fields. Ex-overseers swore they saw him standing at the edge of the marshes, eyes glinting in moonlight. No words, no warning, just watching. And men who once laughed at their slaves would wake screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced the Silent One was still counting, still judging. Some claimed he had become immortal, untouched by disease, by age, by war. Others said he had simply learned to hide in plain sight, moving as a shadow inside the collective memory of the guilty. Even in Reconstruction America, his legend carried weight. White men still barred doors and loaded pistols at night. Black communities still whispered prayers of protection, invoking him not as a threat, but as a guardian against the cruelty that would never truly leave them. Silas had become something more than a man. He had become a warning, eternal, patient, unyielding. Silas didn't just kill, he rewrote behavior. Plantation owners began to live in terror of their own impulses. Every glance, every thought of abuse became a gamble with an unseen hand. Doors were barred, lights left burning, slaves mistrusted as much as masters feared. Silence became the language of survival, a quiet obedience that hid trembling hearts. Among the enslaved, the lesson was more subtle. Fear had been weaponized, yes, but so had observation. They learned to watch, to measure, to understand patterns of power. Silas had shown them that control could be turned inward, redirected with science, intelligence, and precision. A single act, executed carefully, could dismantle empires built on cruelty. Even years later, the psychological echoes lingered. White families who had survived his wrath carried paranoia like a second skin. Black families carried knowledge like a sacred code, whispers of justice hidden in song, in ritual, in the memory of the field. The man who could not speak had taught both sides a lesson in power, that silence is not weakness, that observation is weapon, that vengeance, when precise and deliberate, transcends mere violence. And now, as you listen to this story, consider your own silence. What do you observe that others dismiss? What truth do you carry that can never be spoken aloud? Comment the phrase, "Silas sees all," twice below if you understand. Let it lock in your presence in this unfolding reckoning. 8 men, 8 masters, each chosen not at random, but because of what they had done, what they had taken, and what they had thought they could hide. Nathaniel Grayson, Thomas Wainwright, Edmund Talbot, Henry Prescott. 4 names recorded, 4 lost to rumor, and 4 more, never officially documented, erased from the ledgers as if they had never lived. Each attack followed the same cruel choreography: a locked door, a room isolated, a blade moved with the precision of a surgeon, blood spilled, life altered, pride extinguished, all within hours of a crime the victim had imagined invisible. Silas never left a footprint, never made a sound. He was not a man attacking men. He was a system enforcing balance, a law written in flesh and silence. The planters never understood the pattern. They could not imagine a mind capable of this methodical vengeance hidden inside someone they considered property. They couldn't conceive of patience born from suffering, of intelligence forged in invisibility. And so, the system that had created him collapsed in whispers, in fear, in silence. Silas the Silent had taught the world a lesson they would never forget, and yet few dared to speak his name. Silas never truly left. Long after the plantations burned, after the Civil War reshaped the South, after the world moved on, his shadow lingered. In every locked room, in every whispered threat, in every glance that measures power, he remained, a reminder that cruelty always has a price, that silence can be louder than screams. The elite learned too late that control is fragile, that observation, patience and precision can turn the hunted into the hunter. The enslaved learned that even in the deepest oppression, intelligence and courage are weapons. Silas's story is more than horror. It is truth stripped bare, the hidden ledger of a society built on domination, the system he dismantled one act at a time, the psychological map of fear and justice intertwined. And now, you carry it too, the knowledge that silence can speak, that justice can be precise, that the world you see is never the whole world. Remember this as you leave the shadows behind this screen. Comment the phrase, "Silas sees all," twice. Not for me, not for anyone else, but to seal what you've seen, to mark the transformation, and to recognize the predator in the quiet corners of human history. Once you hear his name, once you understand the pattern, you can never unhear it. Silas is still watching, always.